What purpose the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 165.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 165, a bill to direct the Secretary of the Interior to complete all actions necessary for certain land to be held in restricted fee status by the Oglala Sioux Tribe and the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Westerman, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members are given 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to add extraneous material on H.R. 165, the bill now under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
H.R. 165, the Wounded Knee Memorial and Sacred Site Act, introduced by Congressman Johnson from South Dakota, would place approximately 40 acres of fee land within the Pine Ridge Reservation into restricted fee status for the Oglala Sioux Tribe and Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe. The land would be held as a memorial and as a sacred site in remembrance of the Indian people killed in the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. During the mid and late 1800s, several armed conflicts occurred between tribes, settlers, and the U.S. military on the Great Plains in the western United States. This contributed to distrust, fear, and misconceptions between groups, and the Wounded Knee Massacre was a result of that atmosphere. On December 29, 1980, a group of Lakota Indians led by Chief Spotted Elk made camp near Wounded Knee Creek on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. U.S. Army 7th Cavalry troops were sent to disarm the Lakota. A struggle occurred between the U.S. Army and some of Chief Spotted Elk's band, a majority of which consisted of women and children. A shot rang out, and the U.S. Army opened fire on the largely unarmed group. At the time, it was estimated that approximately 300 Indian people were killed. In September 2022, the Oglala Sioux Tribe and Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe jointly purchased 40 acres of land where an old trading post was located. The piece of land also contains a portion of the area where the Wounded Knee Massacre took place. On October 21, 2022, both tribes signed a covenant stating that this property shall be held and maintained as a memorial and sacred site without any economic development and prohibited any gaming on the land. I applaud Mr. Johnson for working collaboratively with both tribes to develop H.R. 165, which would place the 40 acres into restricted fee status held jointly by both tribes and memorialize their covenant. Restricted fee land contains the same restrictions against alienation and taxation as land held in trust, but the federal government does not hold title. Instead, it will be held by the Sioux and Cheyenne River Sioux tribes. This legislation and the land it sets aside will memorialize and honor the Indian men, women, and children who were killed in 1890. Thank you again to the gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Johnson, and the Oglala Sioux and Cheyenne River Sioux tribes for their work in this important legislation. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Arkansas reserved. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 165, the Wounded Knee Massacre Memorial and Sacred Site Act. This is an important step to honor the Lakota lives lost at Wounded Knee and the Lakota people for generations to come. The bill would place approximately 40 acres of land located within the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation into restricted fee status for the Oglala Sioux Tribe and Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe. This is land believed to be the site of the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre. In the late 1800s, tribes began holding ghost dances for the renewal of stolen land and in protest of the U.S. government, which had prohibited American Indians from practicing their religious freedom. In December of 1890, our government, sent the Army's 7th Cavalry to disarm the Lakota near Wounded Knee Creek, and what resulted was a brutal massacre. Troops murdered over 350 American Indian women, men, and children. 25 U.S. soldiers were lost in that massacre as well. The Wounded Knee Massacre was one of the most atrocious moments in our nation's history. The dark side of that manifest destiny that was romanticized in the President's speech yesterday. In 2022, the Oglala Sioux Tribe and the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe purchased this land and signed a covenant to hold and maintain the land as a memorial and sacred site. This bill would affirm that covenant and would allow the tribes to hold, maintain, and protect the land from any development. I urge my colleagues to support the legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from South Dakota, the lead sponsor of the bill, Mr. Johnson.
The gentleman from South Dakota is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the chair and to the body for bringing up my bill, the Wounded Knee Massacre Memorial and Sacred Site Act, this afternoon. This is the greatest country in the history of the world. And when you're a country that's that great, it is important that you acknowledge your failures and that you try to do better in the future. As has been said, in December 1890, Chief Spotted Elk and his band of Lakota, which largely consisted of women and children, were headed from the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. While they were en route, they were stopped by the Army's 7th Cavalry, and they were forced to make camp at Wounded Knee Creek. It was the next morning, December 29th, 1890, that the 7th Cavalry began to disarm the Lakota. There was a struggle. A shot ran out. And before people realized it, there were hundreds of Lakota being massacred, the majority of which, the overwhelming majority of which, were non-combatants, women and children. On the 100th anniversary of Wounded Knee, this body made a formal apology and expressed deep regret for what had happened that day. Another important step forward was in October of 2022 when the Oglala Sioux Tribe and the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe jointly purchased that 40 acres that is the site of the 1890 massacre. So this bill very simply places those 40 acres into restricted fee status, which is in essence putting it into trust. My bill ensures that those two tribes working together can protect this land as sacred without any commercial development, and they can retain their sovereignty to manage that land appropriately. It was last Congress that I told you all about my trip to the massacre site in June of 2023. It was there I spoke at length to an older gentleman whose grandmother had survived the massacre that day. He, with his own ears, had heard the oral history of the terrible tragedy that occurred that day. I then went and visited St. John's Church, where the Lakota had taken their wounded to treat their injuries. Their blood, the blood of the survivors, stained the floorboards in the church that day. And the wounds of that dark day remain present to this day, and this land is sacred. And I do think this action, this cooperation between the two tribes and our federal government will make sure that we do right as much as we can in the wake of that tragedy. And so, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the Wounded Knee descendants. I want to thank Oglala Sioux Tribal Chairman Frank Starrs comes out, Cheyenne River Sioux Tribal Chairman Ryman LeBeau for their teamwork in advancing this legislation. Last Congress, this bill passed unanimously out of this body. And I would just ask my colleagues to again vote for H.R.165, the Wounded Knee Massacre Memorial and Sacred Site Act, so that we can provide the Oglala and the Cheyenne River tribes the authority they need to protect this land. And with that, I would yield back.
The gentleman yields back.
Speaker, I have no further requests for time. I'm prepared to close and continue to reserve.
The gentleman from Arkansas reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman from South Dakota for this bill, urge my colleagues to support it, and yield back.
Gentleman from California yields back. Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this legislation will further allow the Lakota people to memorialize and honor their relatives and ancestors killed in the Wounded Knee Massacre. It gives the title of the land to both the Oglala Sioux Tribe and Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, while ensuring that the land has the protections provided by restrictions against alienation and taxation. I want to again commend my friend from South Dakota for bringing us this bill. I urge the adoption and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 165? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rule. For what purpose, gentleman from Arkansas?
Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and the nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking the vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.